Hello and welcome to Contemplations. I'm Josh and I'm joined by Hugo.
Hello.
And me and Hugo are going to talk about government schooling and the possible alternatives. And first of all, why might this be important? Well, of course, your education shapes how you think about the world. It's obviously a very important thing. And as people see, the debate at the minute, there's lots of political goings on to do with education where people are trying to use their position as educators to impart beliefs on people that they believe are political and should not be taught to children. But this isn't necessarily the focus. You're going to be looking at it a little bit more broadly than that.
Well, it's partly going to be the focus because I'm going to be mentioning some of the reasons or some of the aspects of schools and schooling that are dreadful, to be honest. And part of it is exactly the kind of present politicization of schooling and of education, right? And I think particularly people on the right or conservatives, I'm surprised that they're not concerned about it more often, or it's not a big deal for them, and they're kind of happy to go on with the kind of traditional story about schools and schooling, and they're not making a bigger fuss about it. Like, that's something that I'm quite surprised about. So it's going to be a little bit of what I want to talk about, but then I want to talk about the system as a whole and of what it is, where it came from, and what some drawbacks of it are, and what then alternatives can be. And I want to kind of make the case that what is considered normal in education and schooling is actually quite horrific, and that it's a tragedy that something like that is happening on a large scale. I think it was actually Trump a couple of years ago who said that schooling and school choice is the civil rights kind of equivalent of the modern era, right? And I think he's right about that. Even though, I mean, I'm not loving that it was Trump who said that, because now everyone's kind of instinctively against it. Everyone respectable, right? And so I think he's right nonetheless. And so elsewhere in another article that I'm going to link below, I've said that free and compulsory education, there's the kind of international standard of what states should aspire to kind of provide to people, or kind of force people to do. That I said that it's an atrocity and a humanitarian horror, which I stand by. And so I would like to explain that a little bit more today.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what I want to do
so,
mainly.
Just to kind of elucidate my role in this, I'm not necessarily here to trip you up. You have a very specific view on schooling.
Yes.
And I don't think I necessarily agree with all of it, of course, but I'm just going to let you present your argument this time and maybe ask questions about it, but I'm not going to try and challenge you as much as you might expect. I'm not going to be pushing back because you have a very specific view. And also there's the fact that when I did my study of psychology, basically whenever there was an option to study education and things like that, I chose something else.
Okay.
Because I knew I didn't want to go into it, and therefore I'd pick other things all the time. So it's probably one of those areas where I probably know the least, but I have obviously picked up bits and pieces.
I mean, I hope I can win you over at least a
Sure.
little bit, so that's probably going to be my goal today as well. And so, to start off, I would like to read a quote by Karen MacDonald, who was writing for the Foundation for Economic Education. It's going to link below, of course. And she's talking about education and government schooling in the context of the pandemic, right? So, as the global coronavirus outbreak closes more schools for weeks and sometimes months, some 300 million children are currently missing class. Parents, educators, and policymakers are panicking. Mass compulsory schooling has become such a cornerstone of contemporary culture that we forget it's a relatively recent social construct. Responding to the pandemic, the United Nations declared that the global scale and speed of current educational disruption is unparalleled and, if prolonged, could threaten the right to education. We have collectively become so programmed to believe that education and schooling are synonymous that we can't imagine learning without schooling, and become frazzled and fearful when schools are shuttered. If nothing else, perhaps this worldwide health scare will remind us that schooling isn't inevitable, and education does not need to be confined to a conventional classroom. And so this is kind of the intro to it, that I think it's kind of a good framing, because what I heard elsewhere, what is kind of a nice saying that is particularly that puts it particularly well, is that if today we started sending kids to school at 6 months of age, then in 2 generations we'd think that without schools kids wouldn't be able to learn how to walk, right? And that's kind of the approach that we tend to have to schooling in general, right? So whatever happens at school and whatever kids are supposed to learn at school, kind of presume through culture and through our kind of inherited experiences that that kids just wouldn't be able to learn in any other way outside of school. When in fact, what I think is true is actually the opposite. That school actually inhibits learning in kids, and kids learn mainly outside of school. And to the extent that something happens at school is probably detrimental to kids learning.
I think there's certainly a spectrum of things which are better or worse in a formal education setting. Things like language get picked up by children. They have, as Steven Pinker describes it, a language instinct, as in it's not something that is belaboured. You pick it up almost automatically. Like you're not teaching babies grammar and linguistics, but they repeat what people are saying, and they have this innate thing. So perhaps speech and language and things like that may come more intuitively, whereas perhaps addition and the kind of math side of things, it doesn't necessarily come intuitively to people. It's got to be something that people have to be sat down and taught, or at least in my opinion. Maybe you'll push back on that view.
Yeah, I would, but I mean, I don't want to get too much into the specifics of
course,
this thing now. But I would say that any kind of learning is better done kind of instinctively and through some kind of open learning environment, rather than forcing someone to sit down and do something that you want them to do, because that's probably the worst way to make someone learn something. But yes, I wanted to say that there's one statistic that before COVID, 97% of US kids attended traditional schools, and 90% of those attended government schools, right? And so that there's the US statistic, and for other countries is even much more, because the US has a big or fairly big homeschooling movement, and so those 3% that don't attend traditional schools, that's a bigger percentage than in many countries. So that's how big of a deal this is. Like if I'm saying that this is wrong and this is kind of misguided and this is evil, well, then that applies to the overwhelming majority of kids. And
would you go so far as to call it evil?
Yes,
it's quite a strong word.
I would, and I want to substantiate it by talking about some background and history of the present education system that we have, right? Because what we have is basically that there are some buildings called schools, that they have classrooms, and kids are put into like big groups by like separated by age, and they kind of are sat in that classroom, and there's a teacher in front of them, and the teacher kind of says something and tells them to do something or talks about something, and kids are supposed to listen. Then maybe they're supposed to repeat, maybe they're supposed to write something down or do some exercises, something like that. And then the hour ends, and then the next hour and the next lesson starts, and they're learning something else, right? And that's how it goes. That's how it goes the whole day, and the next day the same. And so that's basically how it is. And so why people sometimes say that, a lot of people actually say that this kind of system is rigid, that it's outdated, that schools should not kind of be like that, kind of the frontal kind of instruction. They should be more engaging, more kind of lively, and that schools should teach kind of independent thinking, maybe critical thinking, things like that, right? And that schools don't do that, and that's wrong, and that's the kind of classic criticism that people have of schools. Kind of other points might be that there's too much repetition, that it should be more about creativity, that it shouldn't be about kind of learning something by heart and then just kind of repeat that, that kids shouldn't just learn for tests, that they should learn to kind of be able to actually learn something, to actually gain something, and not just to be able to perform well on a test. Then some other criticisms might be that kids produce a lack of enthusiasm. Schools produce a lack of enthusiasm, that kids who go to school are not enthusiastic about what they're learning. And then maybe some kind of not exactly learning related, but other forms. So in some places, schools might be dangerous. There might be a lot of kind of either bullying or outright violence or like these kind of problems. And so this is kind of a big aspect of why people are talking about problems with schools, right? And so then one other additional kind of thing or problem is what you mentioned in the beginning, that right now a lot of people are talking about indoctrination in schools of kind of certain beliefs and certain agendas, being pushed on to kids, and I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to today's age or to kind of the present. I think that's happening at any point, because it's a very efficient way to make people believe what you want to.
It's also
to
somewhat
push on
unavoidable in the method in which people approach education, because it's quite authoritative. You've got to trust the authority of the teacher to dictate what the content is and how you should view it. There's not really much say or debate. There's no one really challenging the teacher. If they are a good teacher, of course, they will present things with, okay, here's the arguments for this, here's the arguments against this, make up your own mind. And that does go on. However, sometimes the approach might be a bit questionable.
And so, as I said in the beginning, I think that conservatives should be especially kind of interested in this, because they are often the ones who consider what kids are learning at the present at some schools kind of awful and bad, and ideologically motivated, and therefore kind of like not exactly what they would want their kids to be exposed to, right? And so this should be a big deal for them, I think. Well, what is often suggested in response to these criticisms are some kind of reforms, right? And those might take forms of like suggestions of smaller classes, maybe better curriculums, better textbooks, better teaching methods, so maybe like I don't know, like project learning or learning in groups rather than separately, less repetition, more creativity, things like that, right? And that's often suggested as a method to address those problems that I just laid out. But even though this is kind of suggested all the time and actual changes are being made all the time, I'm not saying that they aren't, because there's loads of people interested in that and interested in making schools better, and they're sincerely trying to do it. There doesn't seem to be that much of a change, really, right? So the criticisms are still the same. They've been the same for like 100 years or something, and it all seems to be like largely unchanging, despite a lot of people working on how to make it better through these reforms, right? And so why is that? Like, that's a weird thing. I want to kind of get into why, because I think that it's because of the design of the actual institution. And so libertarians sometimes say that this is it is what it is because it's run by government, most schools at least, and government is inefficient and it does things badly because it has bad incentives, which is all true. I'm not disputing that, but I think that's only a part of the picture, right? So, and the other part of the picture is the actual design, as I said, and the design of the institution is that might be what prevents real change from actually happening, right? So people want it to be this kind of beautiful institution where where children get to actually learn what they're interested in, and where they are engaged, they're fascinated by everything, and where they are happy and where they learn a lot, right? Like this all, and where all these criticisms are not applicable anymore because everything's all what I talked about a minute ago. And so people want it to be like that, but the design of the actual institution of a school might be something that is preventing that from happening. And another point is that design and those results might actually be intentional, right? Because when I get into the actual history, just a bit later, I will it's quite clear that the design of today's schools and how it came to be was to produce something completely different. It was not to produce like well-learned people and happy people and make children kind of be enthusiastic into learning something or like these things, right? It was to produce something completely different.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.